right?
What do you have? Ah, you mean to announce the pages? What do we want to have? I think it's not really much of a jump. Okay.
And it's Hollis tonight?
What?
Hollis? Hollis?
Cool. Yeah, I share it here just in case. But
Okay.
I
I don't know.
I'm fine not having it with the piano is easier. It doesn't matter.
Okay,
Whatever you want.
whatever you're doing, I'll do.
My feeling is that we shouldn't, but we
Okay.
kind of like ask Rory what he wants to do. We normally
You don't normally do it?
in Hack we do not
Okay.
wear it. I mean, it's only about leading services. That's what the argument
Yeah,
to.
yeah, yeah. It's fine.
So yeah, because in Sim Shalom,
Yeah.
the jump will be that after Hatzi Kaddish, the festival of Midah is going to be in 3 or 4, and then after that, it's Kaddish Shalem. Do you want to do Kiddush or do you want to do Kiddush?
You can do it. You can do it.
Yes, Sim Shalom is actually much easier.
304.
Do you know this? Kimitzion, Tetze Torah Udvar Adonai. We can definitely finish with Migdal because it has the mention of Torah Temet Natan. And we can, if you want to, we can start with Kimitzion Tetze Torah.
You can also do the other one. I can just like come along.
Which one?
You can do the other one. You can do whatever you were just doing. I can just come along. Sounds nicer than the other one.
Yeah.
What do you?
But again, you're going to be announcing pages unless Lev Shalem has the jumps for the Amidah.
Yeah. So does this one a little bit.
Yes.
So after the service, we'll do your B.
Okay.
Do you have one?
Thanks. Ari, are we opening the Ark tonight?
Tonight?
Yeah.
We're going for the services. This is going to be the so it's not
Yeah.
going to be this, so yeah.
No.
You got a yes for the tallest.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay. It's fine. The argument is that we do it on כי מציון תצא תורה ודבר אדוני מירושלים. 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 חג שמח.
Chag Sameach. We'll begin with Baruch Hu on page 279 in the Sim Shalom, page 39a in the Lev Shalem. We invite you to rise if you are able to.
Baruch Hu את אדוני המבורך.
Baruch Adonai המבורך לעולם ועד.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. אם בסירה ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר
ויום ומביא לילה, מבדיל בין יום ובין לילה. אדוני צבאות שמו, אל חי וקיים, תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני המעריב הרבים. אהבת עולם וקדם אהבת תורה מצוות חוקים ומשפטים אותם
גם תורה ומצוות חוקים ומשפטים כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו ובהם נגע יומם ולילה ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל.
אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך ולכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך.
אדוני אלוהיכם אמת, ונקול זאת וקיים עלינו כי אוזננו על כן נבוא למקום כל הרצים האלה ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ומרים ובני ישראל, לחנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר בקודש, נורא תהילות עושה פלא, מלכותך ראו בניך בוקע ים לפני משה זרי אנו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל.
Continue with Hashkivenu, page 292. Hashkivenu, Adonai Eloheinu, Shalom Aleinu, ושמור צאתנו ואהבנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם, ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך. ברוך אתה אדוני הפורס סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ועל ירושלים. We invite you to rise for Chatzi Kaddish, page 294.
וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל, אל בני ישראל.
יתגדע ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעמד יברח ירתה והמליך מלכותה, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי כל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב אמרו אמן. יש מרבה מברך לעולם ולעלמי עלמיה יתברך, וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויינשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי תקדושה ברכו לעלמין כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן מעלמה ואמרו amen. We continue with the festival Amidah in the Sim Shalom, page 304, and in the Lev Shalom, page 306, taking a moment of silent prayer.
שלווה בארמנותייך. יהי שלום בחילך שלווה בארמנותייך. יהי שלום בחילך שלווה בארמנותייך. יהי שלום בחילך שלווה
We continue with Kaddish Alem, page 316 or page 54, and invite you to rise if you're not already standing. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba, b'amat yivrach yirtei, b'amlich machutei, b'chayechon u'b'mechon, u'f'chayetecho beit Yisrael, b'agala v'zman kari v'yimeru, amen.
יש מרבה מברך לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתרל שמת קודשה ברכו לאלה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן.
תקבל צלחון בתחון דחו ישראל קודם אבונדי וישמעיה ויאמרו
אמן. יש אל רבה מן שמעיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו אמן.
Continue with the Kiddush for the day on page 318.
And page 79 on Lev Shalem. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam bore peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'am veromemanu mikol lashon vekideshanu b'mitzvotav. ותיתן לנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה מועדים לשמחה חגים וזמנים לששון את יום חג השבועות הזה זמן מתן תורתנו מקרא קודש זכר ליציאת מצרים כי בנו בחרת ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים ומועדי קודשך בשמחה ובששון הנחלתנו. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש ישראל והזמנים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
And we continue with Aleinu, page 320 or page 56.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ. ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד.
We conclude with Mourners Kaddish, inviting those who are mourning or marking a site to join us in saying Kaddish, those on Zoom to unmute as we say Kaddish together, page 324 or page 58. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah,
Amen.
be'alma divrach yirtei, ve'amlich malchutei, b'chayechonu v'yamechonu v'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yesh shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam olmei olmaya. Yitbarach v'yishabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yinaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, shmei d'kudusha b'rechu. Leil min kol berchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amiram be'alma v'yimru Amen. Yehi shalama Rabbah min shamaya v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen. Oseh shalom v'imromav aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'yimru Amen.
Amen. So, to conclude the service, we'll go to Nirdi. It's a song. It's one of the piyutim that traditionally is sung around the time of Shavuot, and most of you do not have the words, but just enjoy the piyut. Nirdi, 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 nirdi natan recho, melech bimsibo, yom asa Adonai, nagil nismach bo, el natan le'amo, Torah, תמימה יפה לבנה בהרה חכמה נותנת לפתעים דעת ומזימה ירדה 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 משחקים משמרoma לעם אשר אהב בכל לבבו נרדי 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 נתן רחו מלך במסיבו יום עשה אדוני נגיד נשמחו בכה ויעקב לנחלה לו ישראל לסגולתו חבלו והנחל עליון ימהרה לו תחתית 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 הר כולו תוררו מלאכי אלוהים עולים ויורדים בו נרדי 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 נתן רחו מלך במסיבו יום עשה אדוני
נגיד נשמחו, מסוע בשר, מפלטה חישה, ועוצם מתוקול אבן הראשה, סמוך הנפלה קדושה. נשמת, 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 נשמת חי תברך, נערץ בקדושת, ורוח כל בשר, נשמת חיים בו. נרדי, 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 נרדי נתן רחו, מלך במסיבו, יום עשה אדוני, נגיד נשמחו. חג שמח.
חג שמח.
חג שמח. The air carries my fragrance as far as the king. Nirdi Natan Recho. It's a beautiful piyut that tells the story that we celebrate, of the events that we celebrate this evening, of the giving of the Torah. All the people standing in front of Mount Sinai, ready to hear God's voice, to experience the power of God's presence, to be commanded in a new way of life, a new moral, spiritual way of life, away from the oppression of Egypt and on their way to the Promised Land, incorporating a new approach to life, to reality, revealed at Mount Sinai in the Torah, in the evening we celebrate tonight. It is told that each year on Shavuot, the Torah gets renewed. There's a new revelation that descends on Shavuot, and this new understanding, this new insight of the Torah that is revealed on Shavuot each year is the one that will guide us and carry us in the year ahead. Now we have so many incredible challenges. We have now the challenge of hate and violence in Israel and Palestine raging out of control. We have enormous challenges created by the pandemic all throughout the world, and if it's true that here we're beginning to open up and we're beginning to experience some hope, there are places in the world that are now experiencing incredible suffering and fear and anguish, when thousands of people are dying in India, in South America, in certain places in Africa, even in Europe. People are still not out as we are experiencing here. So the pandemic is posing tremendous challenges and so many other things that we're facing as a country here, as humanity all around the world. And we hope that the Torah will serve to guide us, to guide our journey, to guide us to make right choices and decisions that will bring us life and will bring us blessing, not just to our people, but to all peoples of the world. And so on this night, it is said, according to some of the Hasidic masters, that this is the moment when the Torah of last year has already expired. Whatever learning, whatever insight the Torah brought us last year, it's already expired because a new Torah is about to start. But the Torah was given in the morning, and so we are in this night of Shavuot, in the in-between, in a place which is waiting for the new Torah, the renewed Torah, the old but renewed Torah to be disclosed, to be revealed. And so we are in this place of no Torah, basically. The Torah last year is gone, the Torah of next year is not yet here. And we study and prepare in anticipation for the revelation that will come tomorrow morning as we celebrate the Tfilah, the service of Shacharit, and we read from the Torah. And so on this evening, we are exploring. We are filled with anticipation, with hope, I would say also with great anxiety, because as I said, there's so many challenges, and we hope to be able to have some insights and get some inspiration from the Torah. So we are here, Felicia and I, with two wonderful, wonderful colleagues who have joined us this evening to learn together and to have a conversation about which are the challenges that we face as communities of faith. What are the challenges for people of faith at this time, and at the end of, at least here, at the beginning of the end of the pandemic. And so we are here with the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, who is a highly respected scholar and public intellectual. She's the 16th president of the historic Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, located on 121st Street and Broadway. The first woman to head the 182-year-old institution. Serene Jones occupies the Johnston Family Chair for Religion and Democracy. She's a past president of the American Academy of Religion, which annually hosts the world's largest gathering of scholars of religion. Serene came to Union after 17 years at Yale University, where she was the Titus Street Professor of Theology at the Divinity School and chair of the university's program in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She's the author of several books, including Trauma and Grace, and most recently her memoir, Call It Grace, Finding Meaning in a Fractured World. Serene is a popular speaker, a public speaker, and is sought by media to comment on major issues impacting society because of her deep grounding in theology, politics, women's studies, economics, race studies, history, and ethics. And we have our friend and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Shaul Maggid, who is the Distinguished Fellow in Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Before that, he was Professor of Modern Judaism at Indiana University in Bloomington, and then Associate Professor of Jewish Philosophy at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and the Professor of Judaism at Rice University. And he's also, by the way, the Rabbi of Fire Island. He has a whole island to which he ministers as Rabbi of Fire Island. He spends several months there tending to his congregation in the beach, and also researching and thinking and writing. His work spans the scope of Jewish thought, specializing in Kabbalah, Hasidism, modern Jewish thought, American Jewish thought, culture, Zionism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Shaul has been here a number of times, and we're pleased to have him and to have Serene Jones with us tonight to learn together. So each of us has prepared a text to study, to share. We'll try to unfold, each of us, our own text that we have chosen, and then we'll have a conversation. We can interrupt each other and jump in. So I'll start. My text relates specifically to the experience of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And it comes from a Hasidic master, Rabbi Yaakov Leiner of Ishbitza, who lived in the 19th century. He was the son of the famed Rabbi Mordechai of Ishbitza, known as the Mea Shiloach, one of the major masters of Hasidut. This is his son. He composed a book, actually, with his commentary on the Torah called Bet Yaakov. In his commentary, he addresses the Torah portion that comes after Parshat Yitro, the portion that comes after the Torah portion that describes the events of Sinai and the giving of the Torah, and it's Parshat Mishpatim, the Torah portion that contains all the rules and laws that follow the experience of Sinai. And so he comments, in the morning, the Torah was given, and in the evening, the Mishpatim, the rules and the laws were elaborated. That was revealed or disclosed in the evening, but Torah was given in the morning. That's what the Midrash says, that it was given in the morning. What's the meaning of the fact that it was given in the morning. What this means is that the moment that Israel heard the utterance, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am Adonai your God, they knew that all creations are merely garments for God's will, only that there are gradations, higher garments and lower garments. Let me explain. They understood at the moment when they stood at Mount Sinai and heard the first utterance, the first of the 10 Aseret HaDibrot, the first utterance, which God says, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am Adonai your God. At that moment they understood that all of creation is really a garment, means an enclosure, a layers and layers that contain inside God's will. God and God's will are equivalent. So all of the things in the created world are really enclosures that contain inside God's will. There are some creations that are, as it says here, higher garments, more refined garments, thinner garments, and there are lower garments, which mean coarser garments, which are thicker garments that hide God or protect God or hide God in a thicker way. And they knew at that moment of the revelation that everything in the world contains God, and that if we were to remove these layers, then we would be in the presence of God, God's self. He continues, no one knows the essence of the root of the life of all creation. As it is written in the Talmud regarding the verse, Baruch kevod Adonai mimkomo, blessed is Adonai's glory wherever God dwells. No one knows the place where God dwells. And therefore, since no one knows the place where God dwells, nobody can find where God is. Therefore, no one knows the essence of the root of the life of all creation, because the root of the life of all creation is God. And since we don't know where God is, then no one knows, no one can have the experience of the root of the life of all creation.
It's
And
also-
similarly,
It's also to say, can you hear?
yeah,
The garments are also veils. They're not.
veiled.
They're not only they hide.
Correct.
It's not only about a container, but there's a sense that we can't touch the essence because things are
Because
wrapped.
it's hidden. Right, correct.
Just
correct.
to-
Yeah,
just to be
absolutely.
clear.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. It's true. All of these garments actually hide the
Hide.
essence. They're contained within the garments, but they are there to hide. God is ne'elam. God is sort of, in a sense, hidden within the world. That's a major teaching of the Kabbalah and of Hasidism, is that God is actually hidden in the world, and that we have to actually undo these layers to be able to find God. But nobody knows where God is, because God is wrapped in these veils, so to speak. And similarly, it says in the Zohar, no one knows the root of the point of life that is in the depth of a human heart, which is a beautiful thing, because it means that the root of life is in the very heart of every human being. What are its concerns and its desires? No one knows the root of the point of life that is in the depth of each one of our hearts. For if a person were to know this, they would also know the place where the Holy One dwells. In other words, God is hidden in that place. And if we would know that point of life, the root of the point of life in the heart, then we would know where God is. But God hides there. A person can only estimate what is the root of his or her life. We can approximate, we can have an idea, we can have a sense, but we can't really know it. However, at the moment of the giving of the Torah, all Israel saw clearly that they were truly experiencing the Holy One, and that the entirety of creation is just a garment of God's will. In that moment, in the moment of the giving of the Torah, they experienced God without any of the veils. They experienced the truth, they experienced the root, they experienced the essence of life in all its power, without any layers, without any veils, without any garments. Everything was available to them. Baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo. They experienced the presence of God in that place. And they knew that all of creation, therefore, is garments. All the time, except for that moment, all the time, God is there, but is veiled and is sort of dwelling in hiding within creation and within the human heart. That's, I think, what I find so beautiful about this is that he really talks about the human heart. God is in each human heart, hiding in there. And that if we were to remove the veils, then we would be in the presence of the Holy One, just as our ancestors were in the moment of the giving of the Torah. And they saw clearly, that's what it says, in the morning the Torah was given, because in the morning there's the clarity. You can see with perfection and with clarity. And so they saw the God's presence in that moment. They had that experience. So why I chosen the text, and I would like to open it up, is because I feel that during this time of the pandemic, we had, at least I'll speak for myself personally, moments of great fear. Fear for our lives, for our very own lives, and for the lives of our loved ones. We heard of so many people dying, including people in our own community, people in many of the families of members of our community. And we were afraid, and that moment of fear was also a moment of awe, something that was much greater than us, that we couldn't control. And I felt that in that moment of fear and awe, there was a meeting of something that was much bigger than us. You know, we always feel that we can control, we can somehow manipulate things around. And this time there was no way to manipulate. There was a sense of really very deep fear. And I think in that moment of fear, some things became clear. We came into contact with something that contained some insight, some teaching, something that was unveiled. And we had realizations and some aspects of our reality, I think, in those days, particularly in the beginning of the pandemic. In those days, it's something that became unveiled. And I think we started trying to figure out what is it that we saw, trying to understand what the experience was about. But I feel there was something that was exposed, revealed. Just a little bit like this text is saying about Mount Sinai. So I think we're still trying to figure out what that is. What is it that we understand now that we didn't understand before about our lives, about our world, about our communities, and so on. So I invite you to comment, or we can move on to the next text. The next text is actually, we'll ask Shaul to teach, and then perhaps.
Can I just ask a question? I'm just curious, since obviously revelation at Sinai is a positive thing, even though it is built in with fear, right, that the people were deeply afraid in that moment. The pandemic is not that, right? It's filled with fear, but you know, in a sense, the construction is a very terrible thing. And so how do you, how do you think about moments of revelation coming from places of hardship, like the pandemic, and in relationship to bring that to Sinai, which is obviously a very afuch, it's the opposite kind of experience, although it's evocative of awe and fear, which I think appears in both. I'm just curious, because a lot of people, I think over the years in this community when people have experienced profound tragedies. It's a sense like they have X-ray vision in a certain sense that people, all the muck gets cleared away, and so there's a power of when things burn off in a
I think
sense.
there was a return to some sort of an essence of something, an essence of life. What's essential? What's primary? What are my priorities? I think that the pandemic in the beginning, at least, and even after the beginning, but in the beginning it was, I think, the shock. I think we were all in shock. And I think that revelation or insight can come from hardship and from challenges and from pain. Actually, the Midrash says that at each one of the utterances of the commandments, that these were so powerful, the word of God was so powerful that they died because they couldn't, it was so powerful that they couldn't withstand the power of each one of the utterances, and then they had to be revived. I mean, Midrash talks about fragrances. God sent some fragrances, some powerful, beautiful fragrances that they would smell them and revive them. And then the next utterance would come and they would die again. In other words, there is the experience of death also connected with the experience of Sinai. I mean, the power of that experience, the awe. And I think there's a lot we all can learn, not just from the highs of life and from the joys of life, but also from the pain.
I think if I could I comment before I jump in?
You can comment.
One of the things that what you said raises for me is that, in a certain way, there's something a little bit sterile about the language of pandemic, because in a certain way, what we've experienced is a plague. Yes. We've experienced a plague. That's the language that was usually used for something like this. And one of the things that you see even in the Talmud that deals with these questions of plagues is that there's something very unique about a plague that's even different than a natural disaster like a flood or famine or drought, that there's something about a plague that seems to be radically arbitrary. In a sense, like, you understand, okay, so if the rain doesn't fall, there'll be a famine. We can understand there are earthquakes, there are natural disasters. We can see them coming. There's something at a plague, the invisibility and the arbitrariness of a plague is so striking that, interestingly, when the rabbis talk about a famine, they have a whole tractate of ta'anit where, if there's a famine, you have to go and you pray, blah, blah. And when they talk about plagues, they don't talk about praying. It's almost like it's not about divine human reciprocity. It's just something that's totally arbitrary. In a certain sense, it's the opposite of Sinai, right? Because Sinai is really about order, right? I'm making a covenant with you. If you do these things, I'll protect you. And somehow, a plague it's almost as if God kind of takes away all the protection.
Yeah, I'm not making the equivalence between the pandemic
No,
and Sinai.
no,
Only in the sense of awe or fear.
Yeah.
The power of the experience.
Yeah. No,
That's the only equivalence I'm making. Obviously, it's certainly not an experience of Sinai, the pandemic, but this moment where you feel completely disarmed. Everything that we held on didn't work, and all our assumptions, were challenged, or many of our deepest assumptions were challenged about work and life and health and science.
Yeah, right.
It was a moment where we were completely vulnerable in a sense, and in that moment of vulnerability and openness and awe and fear, I think there is the possibility of meeting something. There's something that opens up, I think by that experience in the heart.
I'm struck in listening to you read this beautiful passage too, with the image of the garments and how at the beginning of the pandemic we're literally wrapping ourselves in garments and putting masks on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this process of sort of like literally the garments are coming on to protect us in ways we don't understand and confuse us. And think about the putting on of those garments of protection, and that we're now coming to the moment where, at least here, they're starting to be removed. So they're being peeled away. But when you think about the meaning of this ritual in this moment, it's like the morning has not come yet. It's like we do not yet know what has been revealed to us. We're just, it's almost as if we're just starting to peel back the layers of all of that fear and all of that confusion. And we're still not there. I think we're still very disoriented and confused, and we do not know what has been revealed. It's like this sort of mystery of the night that we're in. And I think that's the work ahead of us, that as we move into a new space where we're not wrapped, and in fact where we're more vulnerable in the sense that we're now in the world in a new way, it's that trying to figure out what it is we are now supposed to perceive. What has been revealed? It's not as if it comes ready-made. It's a new thing, but we don't know it yet. That's what's so powerful about having this text right now as the pandemic begins to recede and we begin to return.
Yeah, I mean, I think, following on what you said, I mean, what's beautiful here is that in this text is that the Torah is revealed in the morning, and then in the night, it unfolds into all the rules and the laws. In other words, the elaboration comes later. So here...
And the order. The order of it.
The order, right. So here's the up. I mean, that we have had some experience in the night, as you said. And as the morning begins to rise, the sun begins to rise, that's when the elaboration is going to happen, right? Into all the rules and the laws, and we're going to formulate what is that we have to formulate. So I agree with you that we are not there yet, but I think that we have been impacted.
Yes, dramatically.
I think that we have been impacted with something that we're still trying to unfold. I mean, actually, Torah is a constant unfolding. I mean, it's trying to constantly unfold the experience of Sinai. It goes on forever. It says the voice came out, velo yasaf. It didn't stop. The voice is still. And so we're going to be unfolding for a long time, but the impact already was made, I think. And now we're going to try to interpret, to understand, to search. But I think that, and I think actually, it's true that we covered ourselves with masks, but I think we felt very naked. Yes, I think that we felt very unprotected in the sense of very naked, very open. And it's like a camera where the shadow is completely open and the light comes in and impacts, the film, like makes a, and it's like we're blown away. And now we have to try to understand. I think that's a little bit what happens here, is like they're blown away by this experience of the voice of God speaking, blown away. And they see everything for a moment. They see it clearly. And then, then it closes, and then they have to elaborate.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. This is great. And there's something, for at least those of us that are sitting in this room, there's something that is a kind of a newness of being, IRL, as they say, right, in real life, where for most of us for the last year and a half, we were in some state of seclusion. I wanted to also look at a Hasidic text, and I think it's interesting to note that that Shavuot is, of course, the holiday that commemorates the giving of the Torah, but it also happens to be the yahrzeit of the Baal Shem Tov. And it also happens to be the yahrzeit of King David, according to some traditions. So one of the things about there's a lot about the Baal Shem Tov that I'm not going to talk about, but there's a famous dream that the Baal Shem Tov had. And in this dream, he goes up to heaven and he meets the Messiah. And he says to the Messiah, things are pretty bad down there. So, when are you going to come? When are you going to come? So the Messiah says, "V'yafutzu mainotecha chutza." When your Torah is spread out throughout the world, that's when I'll come. And that becomes the kind of marking of Hasidism, right? So in a way, what we're doing, whether it's the Baal Shem Tov or not, it's that by taking the wisdom of the Torah and putting it out into the world, as far into the world as we can get it, that is itself a kind of redemptive act that we do. So I have, it's very interesting in Hasidic literature, but also in other things. So the early Hasidic masters were able to say in few words that the later Hasidic masters need many more words to say. So my text is a little bit wordy, and maybe we won't read through all of it, but I think we could read through some of it. But I want to start with a very short passage that I found very, very potent by an 18th century Italian Kabbalist named Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And he wrote this book, in a certain way, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto probably wouldn't even be that well known if not for this book called Mesilat Yesharim, The Path of the Just. And it's a kind of a classic book of what's known as Musar, behavior, modification, correction. And he begins it, I just have a short passage here I want to read. He begins it in a way that I think really speaks to something that Rabbi Matalan also alluded to. He says as follows, and this is the beginning of his book. So a person is writing their book, they want to start the book, you would think that they want to kind of introduce, I'm going to teach you all of these things. He begins this by saying as follows, I did not compose this work to teach anyone anything they didn't already know. Rather, I write to remind them what is already commonly known. One will not find in these words anything the reader doesn't know or about which there is any doubt. Rather, because of their common knowledge that is evident to all, they often become concealed and forgotten. Therefore, it's not sufficient for the reader to read this text one time because it'll be possible that they will not find anything new after one reading that they didn't know before. The usefulness of this work is only in returning to it constantly in order to remind the reader that which human beings naturally forget, and thus to place on their heart the obligation that is often concealed. It's really, I think, a very kind of interesting little nugget into the difference between knowledge and wisdom. So knowledge, you say, okay, you're in college, you took a course in French, French history. I'm not going to take another course in French history. I already took that course. I already know that stuff. I want to know something I don't know. So what the Ramchal is called the Ramchal, Luzzatto says is that it's not about information. It's not about knowing more. It's about absorbing knowledge into the self. And that requires not going to learn something new, but to repeat something that you already know. And in a certain way, that is kind of what we're doing on Shavuot, and that is really Torah, right? Every week we read the Parsha. Why do we have to read the Parsha? I know the Parsha. I read it last year. I know what the story is. Why do we keep doing it again and again and again? Because it's not about the acquisition of knowledge. It's about the absorption of knowledge to create a certain kind of wisdom. And I think that's why there's a tradition on Shavuot to study Torah the entire night. As Rabbi Matalan said, right, we have to study the Torah the entire night because the Torah of last year is over and the new Torah hasn't really begun. So how do we fill that space, ben hashmashot, so to speak, between one day and the other? So the text I have is from Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar, the 20th century Hasidic figure. He dies in 1979, lived not far away from here in Williamsburg. And the Torah is based on a seemingly contradictory rabbinic teachings. Well, one is a biblical, one is rabbinic. So we know that when the Torah describes the Israelites standing at Mount Sinai, one of the kind of paradoxical things that they say is na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will understand. And, you know, the Midrash tells us that this is the reason that the Israelites got the Torah, because God went around to every other nation and said, do you want the Torah? And they said, what's in it? And they said this, is no, we don't want that. What's in it? What's in it? When it's in it, and at last God comes to the Israelites and says, do you want the Torah? And they say, na'aseh v'nishma. We're not asking what's in it. We're gonna do it, and we're going to then find out what's in it, which is a strange thing to say in real life. The second thing is that the rabbis teach that it's better to be commanded and act on that commandment rather than to act in a state of not being commanded, right? So what Teitelbaum, Yoel Teitelbaum is in there, what Teitelbaum wants to suggest is that there's some incongruity. On the one hand, the Israelites say, we'll do and we'll understand. And the other side, it says, oh, it's better to be commanded and act rather than not be commanded and act. So I heard once a very kind of interesting way of it's better to be commanded than it's better to, well, at least what does it mean to be commanded and act versus not be commanded and act? That there are three kinds of relationships. The first relationship is an acquaintance. And in the acquaintance, a person says to their acquaintance, can you do me a favor? And the person says, well, you know, I mean, when do you need it done by? If I have the time, okay, I'll do it. The friend says, when a person says, can you do me a favor? The friend says, of course. No questions. The really true friend says, when you ask the really true friend, can you do me a favor? The really true friend says, it's already done. I did it without you having to ask me. And in a certain sense, that is the level of doing without being commanded, which in a sense you could say is the highest level, but the rabbis say, no, it's better to be mitzuvah va'oseh, it's better to be commanded and then to do. So Teitelbaum wants to understand a kind of Mobius strip of these two things. So let's see what he says. It appears that what we're saying can explain the Midrashic passage that when Israel said, we will do and we will understand and we will do and we will hear, immediately at that moment God said to them, take for me a truma. This is from another verse in Exodus. Now just set that aside for a moment. He's going to come back to it. As a prelude, it is written in the Yismach Moshe Teitelbaum, which is the great-great-great-grandfather of this, the author of this text, says, in explaining the Midrash that says, when Israel said, we will do and we will hear, at that moment, God took the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, away from them. At the moment they said, we will do and we will hear, God took the evil inclination away from them. This is in accord with the Talmudic teaching in Kiddushin. Rabbi Hanina taught, greater is the one who is commanded and acts than the one who is not commanded and acts. And the Tosafot on that Talmudic passage says, it appears that the reason that it's greater to be commanded and act is that in such a state, a person will be more worried that they won't be able to perform the duty because they know that they're commanded from one who isn't commanded at all. So I want to skip the next paragraph and go on because I think we'll be able to fill it in. Regarding the notion that Israel proceeded with the words, we will do and we will hear, it seems that they accepted upon themselves the Torah without yet being commanded. Thus they said, we will do, and afterward we'll hear. But one would think that they should have actually said the opposite. That is, one who is commanded and acts is greater than one who is not commanded. So why didn't they say, command us first, and so when we act, we'll be doing something at a higher level? Thus the Midrash comes to answer that when they said, we will do and we will hear, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, was taken for them, at which time, once they have no longer evil and any evil inclination, Not being commanded was actually better than being commanded. Thus, in that state of not having that Yetzer Hara, that evil inclination, it was better for them to say, we will do and we will hear. Now, let's just follow him for another few minutes. We don't have to go through the whole thing. Let's go to the top of the next page. With this, we can also understand what was taught in Talmud and Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer said that when Israel proceeded, we will do it, we will hear, a heavenly voice went forth and said to them, who revealed to these children of the secret B'nai Raz? This is how the supernal angels behave. As it is written, blessed God, God's angels, mighty creatures who do God's bidding, who listen to God's words, who do, and then proceeds who will listen. The meaning here is that the angels act in such a manner precisely because they have no evil inclination, thus being commanded and then doing is not preferred for them. Now I want to go down to the last paragraph, and the rest of it is you should read, but I know we're short on time. We can now also understand the Midrash that mature individuals, people who are spiritually refined, whose Yetzer Hara, whose evil inclination is not operational, only need one saying in the verse, this going back to something before, but it's not really relevant, since they do not need to be commanded. Since for them being commanded an action is not better than the opposite. But people who are of a lower spiritual evolved state, meaning all of us, who do have a Yetzer Hara, they actually, because when the Yetzer Hara is operational, being commanded and acting is better than not being commanded and acting. So what I want to say about this is as follows. I think one of the interesting things in terms of when Rabbi Shaul Matalon told us what we wanted to talk about in terms of the future, faith for the future, one of the things that I found interesting is that in terms of what's going to come to us as a community and as a world, we have no idea, right? We would have no idea 2 years ago that we would have been in this state for the last year and a half. I mean, unthinkable, unfathomable. I remember in the beginning of February, before it really started, I was taking a plane from Denver back to New York, and there was a woman wearing a mask, and she had like rubber gloves. And I said, Lo Yu'uman. How could you, what would that even mean that we're all going to wear masks, right? Meanwhile, a month later, of course, it broke. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we can position ourselves to be able to think about how we would respond to that which we don't know. And I think what Teitelbaum is saying is that one of the traps of Torah, and I think this is where the Baal Shem Tov comes in, is in terms of Hasidism. One of the traps in the Torah is to be stuck into the paradigm of being commanded and doing. That kind of notion of obligation, of responsibility, of mandate, that yes, we will do when we're commanded, or we will do because we're commanded. Like the friend who says to his, like the friend who says to the person that asks him to do a favor, yes, of course you'll do a favor because I'm your friend, I feel obligated, I feel responsible. But there's another level of Torah, and that's the level of Torah of doing without being commanded. It's the level of Torah without the Yetzer Hara. It's the level of friendship where the person says, oh, you want this done? I already did that for you yesterday. Right? And that's a level that, in a certain way, is scary. But I think one of the things that Hasidism or the Baal Shem Tov or whatever introduces into Jewish life is that we have to really, even though we live in a world where we all have evil inclinations and we're all basically in that lower state, there are moments, like Rabbi Matalon said in terms of clarity, right? There are moments where you have to get beyond commandedness. And you have to do something because of your love for God, your love for the other, your love for the world. And that's a place that is very precarious, because if you're not commanded, it takes you outside of the whole Marechet. It takes you outside of the whole thing. But one of the things that Sinai teaches is that, interestingly, the very moment where commandedness emerges is a place where commandedness is irrelevant. That's the place of Naaseh v'Nishma. They should have said the opposite. You're going to command us, so command us already, and we'll do it. So the very place that the mitzvah emerges into the world is the place where the mitzvah itself is not an act of response to a command, but is a pure act of love. And I think that if we can maintain both of those, the commanded and then acting out of sheer love, I think that we have the potential to be able to confront anything that comes our way.
You keep referring to Rabbi Matanon. Nobody knows who that is.
Okay.
My name is Rolly.
Okay, Rolly. Okay,
So, but Shaul.
Okay.
So, I think it's the fact that we are trapped in a system of commandments, right? We do everything as commanded. And if we continue to be trapped in the system of commandments, we'll never have the flexibility, we'll never free ourselves to be able to meet the future, right? So this is a moment of Naaseh v'Nishma now, in terms of we will do, and then we'll seek to understand we will do new things. We'll have to do things. So is this a moment where new commandments are going to, where we have the opportunity to formulate new commandments? New commandments in the same of new norms, new protocols, new ways in which we do things in terms of faith, communities.
Obviously later on historians will look back at this moment, but I think that this moment is potentially a watershed moment for human civilization. I heard Noam Chomsky say something like this similar. I think this is an inflection moment, and there have been other times in history where this has happened, where everything gets shaken up in a certain sense. And I think we're seeing, not to make any connections between the pandemic and all the things going on in the world, but it seems like there's been this seismic global, snow cone. The snow cone got shaken up, and all of the things get kind of displaced and discharged. So I think so. One of the things I noticed, and in walking down the street, is, okay, we were commanded to wear masks. We were mandated to wear masks. And then all of a sudden, they say, okay, you don't have to wear masks. It's interesting how difficult it is for people to take the masks off, right? It's fascinating, right? And I'm wearing it on your chin because you can't really take it off. There's a sense of that. I experienced this sense of the way in which, as you said, the commandment it locks you into a way of being, and changing that, even though everyone wants to take their mask off, no doubt, right? But there's something that, I don't know, and I think it's a fascinating human moment, just walking down the streets of New York City and watching the low-level anxiety that people have about this sense of, in a sense, Naaseh v'Nishma. I need the mask, I don't need the mask. I have to wear the mask, I don't have to wear the mask. And I think this speaks to a much broader sense of where we are. And I think you're right. I think historians will look back at this 100 years later and will say, something happened in 2021 to the world. Because one of the interesting things about this is, right, it's global reach. It's not about nations, it's not about peoples, it's not about classes, it's not about colors, it's not about races. The pandemic was the great global equalizer, in a sense. And I think that's a big lesson for us to learn.
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no.
Right.
I think about the equalizer question. But I do think it's interesting, even just thinking about how we responded around Jewish law when the pandemic came to be, how quickly we morphed and kind of were willing to let certain things go in terms of minyan and, morphing things onto Zoom, and there was a sense of we have to. Like we researched, we did what we needed to do, but there was a calling that was larger in a sense than the structures we knew in order to create a religious life online, which we didn't ever know before, which was a much more immediate and acute moment in time when we had to shift essentially everything online. It's much harder to imagine now what the next phase, not under the same kind of pressures, not to return to what we already knew, that we know the boxes that we have to tick, but that the impact of having made that switch so quickly and having lived like this for a year plus, then what does it mean moving forward, and what is the call of this moment, which I think, going back to Serene's point earlier, is unknown. There are some things we've learned on a more practical level in terms of religious life and multi-access and how much more we can meet people online, all those kind of technical invitation things that have morphed over this time. But I think the greater, deeper essence questions are not clear, and that feels like, are we going to be able to be responsive and not be so stuck in this operational mode that, particularly in Jewish life, we become very automatons in response to kind of the way we should do things, that the shoulds actually blind our vision. And I think that's a really interesting moment, particularly for Jewish life, which is so regulated by law and what's right and wrong, and is very, has often very little gray.
I think it would be a wonderful thing if this moment, we could use this moment as a moment of great creativity and experimentation. In other words, as you said, we are so attached. I mean, particularly we Jews who live within a system of commandedness, a system of mitzvot, that regulates all our lives, our communal lives, our personal lives, and so on, that we could take advantage of this moment to free ourselves a little bit from the structures, not for the sake of pure autonomy, but for the sake of reinventing, for the sake of reimagining, for the sake of experimenting and creating a new paradigms. I mean, the moment of, as you said, it's a moment of paradigm shift. To look at the moral questions, at the spiritual questions, and create norms and protocols and paths forward. Not without commandments, but to create a new commandment. What is this moment commanding us? It's like the moment at Sinai, the encounter with God. Commands, Naseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear. It's a moment where people felt they had to respond to that moment, and we have to respond to that moment, but not with the old. Not with the old categories, but hopefully with new categories.
Because to go back to your text, because that's the garment, yes. Right? Like the structures or the garments that we often use as the essence. And
it's funny that there's this I want to turn to that there's this tiny, almost invisible microbe that has taught us that all of the differences that we create in human civilization are ultimately meaningless. So, Felicia's right. Obviously, it's not equal. People have more access and less access. But the very fact that this tiny virus, and all it wants to do is survive, like everything else in the world, has basically taught human civilization that all of the differences that we've created mean zero, because we can all die from this tiny invisible thing. It's actually kind of like mind-blowing in a way, and can institute a certain kind of, as you said, a paradigm shift to rethink how we structure our lives.
And I think part of that paradigm shift is just the other side of it is the restructuring that happens is that little microbe rips off the cover that, that makes us think that we are all equally vulnerable and equally protected. And we're not equally vulnerable and equally protected. Some of us are much more vulnerable than others. And so it is, what has been revealed is not just a leveling of everyone, but it's also the hierarchy has come unveiled, and there it is. You know, vast hierarchies. You think about India right now, and it's just mind-boggling to try to take in what is happening there. And that's a kind of non-leveling. It's a sort of moment when you realize we're not level. And that's almost even more startling than being leveled, is to realize that, in fact, you know, the degree of protection that you assume, and that is very disorienting. I also think under the pandemic, the experience of being commanded was constant.
Yes.
You were commanded all the time. Put your mask on, you know, clean your hands, go here, do this. And of course, we saw across the country how differently people respond to being commanded. Like with some people, you tell them they have to put on the mask, and that's the reason for not putting on the mask. So we were both commanded, and yet we saw in the political sphere the resistance to commandment. So we have commandment, resistance to commandment. And then here we are at this moment where commandment, resistant to commandment, as the kind of dividing dynamic, still has its echo, but it can't play the same role. And so what role is love going to play in that space where commanded or not commanded collapses? Like you're no longer the one who wears the mask or doesn't, who stands on this side of the political divide or this side. It sort of collapses, and then we have a choice at that inflection point to make. And is it that moment of love that's so pure that is revealed?
I think that's also true about, right, the mask, not mask regulation that happened in terms of the pandemic, but it also deregulated our lives in certain ways too, because we were stuck in not being in our regular commanded cycles, right? And so in what we thought we always had to do or should do, then the level, you know, that all got changed. You know, it never would have occurred to us that we could have worked from home, for those of us who had that capability during the, you know, all these things about how we lived that were assumptions about how we were supposed to live or commanded to live, and that all of a sudden much of that was thrown, not for essential workers, but for many of us who had the privileges of actually recognizing that there were choices in what we perceived were the commands of our lives. And now, you know, as we are coming out of this, going into, in some way, a more foggy space, which the regulation that we presumed was true is been shown to be not true anymore. And so therefore, what is the truth of what the calling of the hour is? And I think that's been very destabilizing, to really ask those questions. I thought it had to be this way, or I thought I needed to do it this way. And for those of us who have had the spaciousness to even consider those questions, which is also, again, one of the places of non-equalizer, you know, those of us who get to think about these things, that in itself is very destabilizing, because we were running on a certain assumption of what we were commanded to do, and now that's been taken away. And so we have to choose. And that choice is much, we didn't think we had a choice before, but now we know we actually do. And that, I think, is a really, question about faith. It's a question about life priorities and what's important, which I don't think, I can speak for myself. The questions that I've been asking in this moment are different than I did, you know, a year and a half ago. As a rabbi, how I live my life, how I work, my relationships with my children and my family, all these constructions that I thought had to be a certain way. And I think that's a really, like, what's the love underneath? And some of that love has been awakened differently.
I think there's a sense of an internalization of an inner commandment of solidarity. I think that we saw that with and of, in many ways, also self-sacrifice. We saw that with all of the people who are on the front lines, who in the hospitals and in the streets. And I think there was an identification with those people. For those of us who are in our homes and we're seeing this and hearing and seeing them on TV and coming at 7 o'clock each evening to express our gratitude, there was an internalization of a sense of, it's great, solidarity is a great thing. We're not just to live our lives as individualistic people as we had before. And I think there's an internalization of the commandment to solidarity. It's not fully yet expressed, but I think that there's a seed that was planted. And I think that the wearing of masks by choice now here is an expression of that, of an expression of human solidarity, of having internalized, I'm not just going to do what's only good for me, which was the way we operated before, but I have regard for the members of of the community in which I live, in my neighborhood, the subway and the public transportation and the store. I think there's an opportunity now to build on that, on the commanded, on the sense of being commanded to be, what's the English word, solidarious, to act in solidarity.
It's an interesting example of the heroism of the everyday. We normally think of heroism in extraordinary ways, either leaders, but here you have a situation, as you said, in terms of frontline workers, in terms of essential workers, a certain kind of heroism that doesn't come from anything that they did differently than they did before. But in this moment, that very act becomes a heroic act. And they weren't doing it because they were commanded to do it. They were doing it because they felt an obligation to do it. They felt a responsibility to do it. So in a certain sense, it's an interesting, they, in a certain way, were embodying a kind of Nasev Nishma. That they might not have known that they were even capable of doing until they were put into that situation. And that's why I really think it's a kind of heroic act of the everyday, right? Not of the extraordinary.
And those people in the community became teachers. They showed something. They showed a way. I think we have a lot to build on that. I think moving forward, we have a lot to build on that. Internalizing that sense of obligation to solidarity. We're not there yet, in the sense, we're hoarding vaccines, millions and millions of vaccines. When there are millions of people who need them in other parts of the world, and we're still holding back.
I mean,
Maybe we'll get there.
You could say also that's true. I mean, in terms of the heroism of the day-to-day, of which some people were choosing or took on that commandedness, other people just needed to get paid a living wage, right? Yeah. Like that, the structures that solidarity would look really differently if the structures of our society that we relied upon from frontline workers like delivery folks or nurses or, grocery store workers, that we would actually honor their heroism now that we've seen it in the structures of how people are paid or, that solidarity, how that manifests in structural change or systematic change is, I think, a really big question. I remember there was a piece in some magazine that I read about, don't call me a hero, in a sense, pay me a living wage, right? Like that how we lift up that sense of society that really triumphed in that moment, but how does it stick? And how do we honor our commitments to that sense of heroism, which we only could see for a period of months that we hadn't seen before. And I think that's really one of the questions moving forward about equity and really how we give people a pathway to truly live, and that we're reliant upon, but we didn't really see that until the last year. So I think that's a really big question as a faith community, really how we embody that internally in our own institutions and really push for that sense of obligation and solidarity systematically and structurally beyond just a sense of level of commitment to humanity with love and generosity. And I think that's a really big question now, now that that's been exposed.
I'm just also aware when I think of 2021 and this, the inflection point and a global turning point, it feels like just a series of convulsions or seismic rattlings. And it wasn't just the pandemic. There were just so, the description of all of the different layers and all of the different garments, there's so many layers to everything that continued to happen. And it's sort of the seeing these heroic acts, everyday acts of enormous love and care and self-sacrifice. At the same time, you're seeing sort of the rise of just explicit hatred and violence. That just, it's like it's coming out of, it's been there all the time, but it's like seeping out from the earth and rising up. At the very same time, the pandemic is sweeping across and, grabbing a hold of us. This is why one of the poems that I chose,
let's go to your teaching.
Just to jump into the teaching, I'm going to jump into my third piece, Asleep of Strangers. And it's about, I like this particular poem written by a man with Christian theological training, but it's about what it feels like to be in this moment. And it says, the human heart can go the length of God. Cold and dark it may be. This image of the human heart, Rolly, that was in your first reading, that the wisdom that is there, the essence that is there. But it is no winter now. We're thinking here, I have images of climate change, but also the thawing. Is the thawing that's happening, is it good, is it bad? Is coming out from under the pandemic, is what awaits us more hopeful, or is what awaits us more of a breaking down? The frozen misery of centuries cracks, breaks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the flows, the thaw, the flood, the upstart of spring. See, this sense it's all cracking open. But this is where this particular reading just sort of gets me in the gut. Instead of saying, how is it that we've made it through this year, is to say, thank God our time is now. Thank God we're in the midst of this. How precious, what a gift it is to be thrown into the wreck of it all. For what is this time? It is a time when wrong comes up to face us everywhere. It's not just one place. It's not just the pandemic. It's the gross racism and violence. It's the levels of poverty, child poverty. The list continues. It's all of the anti-trans legislation trying to be pushed through. It's the destruction of voting rights. It's the breaking down of even the capacity to teach about race in schools. I mean, the pile is just getting huger and huger, and you think it has come up to face us everywhere, and it will not leave until we take the greatest stride of soul that people ever took. And this describes this moment so well. Affairs now are soul-sized. The stakes that we're wrestling with in this moment are soul-sized. They're of gargantuan proportion. What hangs in the balance is truly critical to our survival as human beings and as a earth. And then it brings it back to that essence that is only seen in that one moment. The enterprise is exploration into God. It says that this moment that we are in, where all the wrongs of the past have come up to take a hold of us and will not let us go until we take the greatest stride that humanity has ever taken, it is to say that this moment, more than anything, is a moment of spiritual crisis and of spiritual possibility. It's about our souls. It's about the reality of the divine. It's about God. It's, you know, the consequences of it go all the way down. It's not about just getting the technology right or spreading out the goods appropriately. It's really a deep reimagining that we're given the possibility of having as we explore. Now, sometimes when I, put it in that level of magnitude, it can be a little bit overwhelming. It's like, oh my goodness, well, what does this mean? That we are at a point in time where all of it is shifting and our imaginations are shifting. Most importantly, our understanding of what soul and transcendence is shifting. You can't get bigger, deeper shifts than that. And I put in here this short statement by Dietrich Bonhoeffer from his Letters and Papers from Prison. And this statement is one that I go back to because it sort of calms me in the moment that I am able to grasp the magnitude of what is before us. And I'll just read it. It's so pertinent to this particular moment. We have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We have been drenched by many storms and fires and plagues. And we have learnt the arts of equivocation and pretense. Experience, you could say, of the pandemic has made us suspicious of others and kept us from being truthful and open. Intolerable conflicts have worn us down and have made us cynical. I would say exhausted. I'd say bone exhausted. Are we still of any use? And then this is so beautiful. What we need in this moment is not geniuses or cynics or misanthropes or clever tacticians, but plain, honest, and straightforward people. Will our inward power of resistance and resilience, I would add, be strong enough, and our honesty with ourselves remorseless enough for us to find our way back or our way forward to simplicity and straightforwardness? And that, in terms of those moments during the pandemic, but also the continued convulsions of this last year, those are those moments when all of the equivocations and the cleverness and the detritus that we've used to surround ourselves and robe ourselves to give our life meaning, as they keep getting, plucked away. One of the things that became the most clear to me was how little I needed and how simple, in the course of a week, life could become. Utterly simple. Like I had to find food to eat, and I had to stay in my house, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. And you weren't allowed to do anything else. I mean, it was sort of this like immediate enforced simplicity that you can't quite get over. You realize I every day now I'm starting to have to put my regular clothes back on, and I open my closet door and I look at all those clothes and I think, what was I thinking? All of these clothes. Or I walk around my house and I see all the objects I have that I barely had time to even look at in the fast pace before the pandemic, and I think, what is all of this? And to think that the essence is simple and that it's straightforward. It's mysterious and it's hidden, but it's also straightforward. There's no trick in this. In fact, trickery is what we need to get beyond. So I'll stop there, but this is the sort of collection of thoughts that have been coming up for me as I wrestle with this huge shift taking place, and how we think about the spiritual magnitude of it.
I love the verse that you chose from Isaiah, which you didn't read. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. I just want to comment on something. These are very beautiful and powerful readings. You talked about technology and spirituality. And as you were speaking, I am concerned, afraid that we're going to get the technology right. We're going to focus on the technology. We already are. We're going to get the technology right, and we're not going to get the spirituality right. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be lagging. The technology is going to suck all the energy, mm-hmm, and all the money and all the attention, and we're going to get it right. And the spirituality we won't have taken the opportunity to work on it and, mm-hmm, bring something forth that is, mm-hmm, new, simple, straightforward, without tricks, but honest. And I'm afraid of that it's going to get away from us.
Yeah. But the thing I find interesting in this, I love the Isaiah piece, especially when it says, I am about to do a new thing now. Now it springs forth. It's not like tomorrow it's going to spring. Now it springs forth. But the question to the listener is, do you not perceive it? It's like it assumes that it's happening now and we can't see it, even though it's as huge as a way in the wilderness or a river in the desert. But what's fascinating about the poem "A Sleep of Strangers" is that these harms from the past have come up to grab a hold of us, and we may be distracted and ultimately not deal with the spiritual because of the technological, but those harms are not going to let go of us. So we're sort of at that moment where the confrontation with our own mortality and the confrontation with the gross injustices of our world, if we don't engage it, it's not as if it's going to go away. And so what does that world where it's not engaged look like? It is not a healthy place, but it's
not
very
going to go away, but the technology can cover up.
Yeah.
And social media, and cover it up. The noise covers it up. the busyness covers it up.
I mean, I think in some way we've been having this conversation for a while now about the technology question that, because access was so easy for this last year plus, that must be the answer in a certain sense. But it may actually be that the need had shifted, which is why people gained access. In a sense that people weren't just signing up because they didn't have a need. Obviously, something was awakened in people that whatever was taking place, whether it was our daily minyan or was anchoring people. But I think it's true, Oli, what you said, that we displace the answer on the technology and are not asking the question of what is the need now, and I think there is a certain kind of simplicity, I think, that has been revealed about need. I just need, people are saying about hugging, right? Like, just the touch of a hug feels so enormous in these moments when we've been so deprived of that simple act, which before we wouldn't have thought of 2 seconds about that kind of, and I do think that there's been a kind of zoning in on kind of both the well of need and the simplicity of what serves that. And in some sense, religious life has often, I think, become very gimmicky because, at least in institutionalized Jewish life, we were mentioning the Pew study, like all the people who aren't affiliated or who have left, and I don't know that conversation in liberal Christian spaces, but there's such a profound concern about the lack of connection and the lack of affiliation and support of Jewish institutions, that there's like a grab desire. Well, if we do this, that'll get them, or if we do this, that'll get them. And I do think that there's, in the desire to quote connect or to give people a taste of faith, we actually diminish what is at the essence of what is the heartbeat of our faith, which I think we've all in some way found so blessedly, but you can't gimmick that out. You actually have to do the real thing. And this moment, I think, is going to be confusing in that way. And I feel concerned about it. That, I mean, even we, because we've done a lot technologically to get ourselves up to a certain place, to be accessible and have it feel intimate, which we've heard from a lot of people, but what is intimacy going to look like religiously in 4 months when most of us at least can be back in the sanctuary? I mean, they're big questions.
I think these are beautiful readings. They really are. I think one of the things that comes out for me is as much as there's a lot of optimism in terms of turning the corner and the end of the pandemic, reaching the finish line, whatever metaphors are being floated around, it is, as you said, an incredibly precarious moment because within the kind of Jewish tradition, the klipa, the powers of negativity, they will always come up, right? And they'll always be right there, and they'll always be, and in a certain sense, Rolly, you're right in terms of covering it with technology, and maybe there's a lesson to learn because, now we were hearing that, we thought that the Roaring 20s was because of World War I, when actually it was probably the 1918 flu pandemic, which then people just broke out, and it was euphoric, and people, music, and the rise of Nazism came less than a decade later. Less than a decade later, we were in a world war. First we had a global depression, and then we had the kind of epitome of human evil. So I think that's the kind of real precariousness. The spirituality failed to take root at that time, and other forces took power, and human civilization suffered as the result of that. So maybe that's a good lesson to think about this springtime. I live most of the year. I live in Vermont in the woods, so I kind of experience spring in a way that you don't when you live in Manhattan, and it's beautiful, and the world is waking up and coming back to life, and the animals, but it's also incredibly precarious and potentially destructive. And I think that these readings really bring out that sense of hope. I mean, Bonhoeffer, of course, paid with his life. Mm-hmm. That sense of hope and hopelessness, and the sense of light and darkness, and the sense of good and evil and potential, listening to you talk about these things, to explicate them, it brought a certain sense of fear, almost as powerful as the fear of the pandemic itself. Yeah. Right? The post-pandemic period, because those forces of evil will be right there, and they are right there in all the ways that you said, and in a myriad other ways. They're there, and they're going to challenge to take up that space if somehow, we don't grab hold of it and do it ourselves.
Okay. So actually, I was hoping you were going to speak about ceremony, because it's one of my favorite books by Leslie Silko. It's a short book, but it reads like a ceremony, like a ritual. And I encourage everyone to take a look at it. But in many ways, when I was thinking about the question that we were asking tonight, I was thinking, how does the tradition or the stories of our tradition try to help us think about life in ceremonious ways? How do we ritualize in some way? In many ways, I think our tradition tries to, the Jewish tradition at least, tries to coach us towards a discourse in our lives that kind of sets us up to wrestle with things. And so as I was thinking about the question of time and future, I thought of these series of short teachings from Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, which is a midrashic work of the, probably edited in the 8th or 9th century. And we often have studied at BJ this small section of Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, which says that before the world was created, the Holy Blessed One with God's name existed alone, and it occurred to God to create the world. God began to trace the foundations of the world, but it would not stand. They told a parable to what is this matter like to a king who wishes to build a palace for him or herself. Well, the king is going to build it for himself. If he had not traced in the earth its foundations, its exits, and its entrances, he does not begin to build. Likewise, the Holy Blessed One was tracing the plans of the world, but it did not remain standing until God created repentance. So we often study this text at the time of the High Holy Days. We think about that repentance, or tshuva in Hebrew, which really means a return to the essence, is what functionally makes the world exist. And if you think back to the parable, that to have exits and entrances, like to have a way to go in and out and move around and change our path, that there needs to be something structurally in the world that creates that possibility. And according to the tradition, repentance or tshuva, better, the return to some kind of essence, the ability to not get stuck in a static form. And in many ways, that's a ritual way to think about life in our tradition, which is that nothing is static, that we have to have entrances and exits, and in doing so, we create the possibility for the world to stand. And I think in many ways, that's the only thing that God created in that moment, that this story tells us is the baseline of our existence, which is tshuva, the sense that we can change, or we need to change, or we need to go back to some kind of essence. When we hold on, I think you spoke earlier, Roli, about that we hold on to so much, but ultimately, according to this midrash, actually, what we should hold on to most is that things need to change, and that we need to go back to some kind of essence, and that is actually what it's, I mean, somewhat of an oxymoron, that the thing that makes things stand is the thing that makes us change, right, or go back. But we often, after we study that text, we don't see what's next in the text, because we move on to some other text about tshuva, which is appealing. But the next piece of that section says, 7 things were created before the world was created. They are the Torah, Gehinom, which is kind of the Jewish version of hell to some degree, Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, the throne of glory, the temple, repentance, and the name of Mashiach. And so already we're seeing, at first there's a hierarchy, right, that the essence is tshuva, that this baseline for the world standing, but then right before the world is created, these other things, 7 things which are the eternal things, essentially, they seem to indicate that on the precipice of creation, there is something that precedes it, that are, I mean, the list is in some way not surprising, right? They're in the polar opposite, Gan Eden and Gehinom, the most glorious place and the worst of the places, the existence of God, the name of God, and the Torah, which is essentially the guide through life, and then the Mashiach, which is a very forward, future-oriented thing. These are the 7 things that the tradition kind of says they're pre-creation. They existed before, and they are eternal things that are in some way unchanging, you know, even though repentance is the baseline, which is always changing. And so the fact that the tradition, which often doesn't like to complicate, the tradition has a resistance to actually looking back about what happened before creation, raises this question, what is eternal? What preceded creation? And the presumption is will outlast creation to a certain degree. And the fact that the tradition on the precipice of creation wants us to know something about something that's eternal. And in my mind, there's this coaching again, right? Tshuva was put as one thing. The standalone thing is repentance. And then there are these eternal things that are outlasting everything else, which means, in a certain sense, once creation begins, not everything else is eternal, right? Creation gets destroyed, it gets built up, it gets changed, but the tradition in that liminal moment wants us to understand something about what's eternal. And then much later on, I mean, the first 19, 20 chapters, aside from chapter 1 and chapter 2 of this midrash, are all about what happens on each and every day of the creation and the intricacies of that. And then we arrive on Erev Shabbat at the twilight, Ben Hashmashot, which we spoke about earlier, on this liminal space between the 6th day and the arrival of Shabbat, and we get another list about what gets created in this liminal space and twilight between the 6th day and the 7th day. So this list is really different than the previous list. This list is, let's look at it for a minute. 10 things were created on the eve of Shabbat in the twilight, and it uses the expression Ben Hashmashot, which is also a list that appears in Pirkei Avot. The mouth of the earth, this is the mouth of the earth in the book of Numbers that swallows up Korach and his companions. The mouth of the well, which is the well of Miriam that feeds the people water in the desert. The mouth of the ass, this is Bilam's donkey who speaks. the rainbow of Noach that appears as a covenant, a sign, the manna from heaven, the shamir. This is the stone that was able to cut the ephod out. The worm. Oh, that was able to cut the stone. That's right. Exactly. The worm that was able to cut it sounds like Chad Gadya, right? The word that, the shape of the alphabet, the writing and the tablets of the law, and the ram of Abraham. Now, the Hebrew actually doesn't indicate the ram of Abraham. There are a couple of different lists. So this list, which is another liminal moment, speaks to things that are coming down the pike that are unnatural moments. They go against natural law. The donkey that speaks, the well that travels in the wilderness, that's not just one they stumble upon, the opening of the earth to swallow Korach, all these, the worm that cuts the rock, all the rainbow that appears unnaturally in the sky in some, I mean, naturally after rain, it's true. But in a sense, I think what this list does for me is the previous list was about what's eternal, and this list is about what is the unexpected that we need in a given moment to appear. That we live life and we have horrible things happen, we have glorious things happen, and something in the moment appears or shows up to answer the need of the moment. And the tradition, I think, wants us to ritualize in some way that isn't going to appear out of nowhere. In some way, God wanted these longings to exist in the universe from the beginning, or from this, that what happens later pre-existed us, that it was built into the structure of the world to answer a need of the moment. And those things were created in a liminal moment. They were all created on Erev Shabbat. So what I find moving about this set of things that were created, which, you know, the Midrash goes into detail about why the tradition can give that answer, etc., is that liminal moments, pre-creation, Erev Shabbat, are moments of profound creativity. They existed in the story of our tradition as moments that called for something to arise, pre-creation and Erev Shabbat, and that the tradition wants us to see those moments as creative moments, that liminal moments are creative moments. They're moments for imagination, and that's even one stage of how we should think about this time, which is when we're in the in-between spaces, we're called in some way, the way God was called to in these stories, to say, what needs to be created now? What is the response to the not knowing, the in-between that says, there's something that needs to be created to answer a need that we don't even know will be for the future. And the second thing I think that's powerful about these lists is that there's a question, I think, as a person of faith, what already exists and what doesn't exist? Like, what is already built into the structure of the universe that we have to unfold out, or what is it that we actually have to create anew? And I think that's one of the questions of this moment, which is we don't know whether we have what we need or whether we're going to have to create something new. And our tradition, I think, wants us to say yes to both of those questions. That on the one hand, liminal moments are moments of profound creativity, and on the other hand, God implanted something in the world that allows us to kind of call them into existence and help us tap into them. And So in some way, the specifics of the list are less important, and rather the imagination that constructs a list like this for me, which is to really hold that tension. And I feel like as a religious person trying to faithfully move through the future, I'm really asking myself, what do we have to dig into to actually learn that we can see that's already built in? Or what in this liminal space do we have to create to answer some future need? I don't know the answer to that question, but I feel like that's what these texts teach me about thinking about past, present, and future.
I can see why you like the ceremony in the Leslie Silko, because that whole piece is about the stories, and they're both very ancient, and without them we die. And we have to protect them. And yet the last image is the story being in the womb, and it's still growing, and it's alive. So it's like the earth. It's old and ancient, and yet changing and new.
Birthing.
And birthing.
Yeah.
True newness.
Yep. Yeah.
It's a great Shavuot Torah in a way, because this idea of Ben Hashmashot, which Roli introduced, right, between the times, is really that moment of Shavuot. So really, in a certain sense, like this particular moment of the Jewish calendar is the year when that whole list, certainly the list of chapter 19, suddenly becomes activated, right, in a way. So that, in a sense, there's this great little twist where there's a verse in Jeremiah that says, Torah me'iti tetzeh, right, that God says Torah will go out to you, right? Yeah, right. And so in Leviticus Rabbah, they add the word chadasha. Torah chadasha me'iti tetzeh, that a
new Torah will
that
come
a new
out from
Torah
me.
has to come from me, right? And in a certain sense, I really, what I'm drawing from what you're saying is that, okay, God is saying the Torah comes from me, but then God is saying to human beings, but the new Torah, that's to come from you. I can't give you that. The chadasha part is yours, right? And it's in that space of in between, right? It's not congealed yet. It's still happening. It's in the moment, and it is. I do think that we're living now in this pre-post-pandemic time. It's a Ben Hashmashot, right? We really are Ben Hashmashot. I mean, you walk in the street and you see some people wearing masks, some people not wearing masks. There is this liminality or liquidity to the time, which from what you're teaching here in the Midrash, takes us back to these kinds of almost magical moments, right? They're part of nature, but they're not really part of nature. They're part of nature, but they don't work according to natural law, right? The donkey doesn't speak, right? The earth doesn't open up and swallow, right? There's that in between the natural and the supernatural that is that Ben Hashmashot, and maybe that's where that's where we are. It's certainly a frightening place to be, but it's also, as you said, it's the moment of creativity. It's the chadasha. It's the newness that becomes possible.
I read it a little differently. So I read it that we are in this moment of transition between the twilight, between the old world that is gone and the new world that is being born, being birthed now, post-pandemic, or in the middle of our way out, now with vaccines, with all the turmoils that Serene referred to, political turmoils, issues of race, poverty, all of the stuff that just flooded us. The frozen misery of centuries cracks, breaks, begins to move. So we're in that moment, that liminal space of transition. And there's a story that is going to be written. We're going to write the story together with God in that dialogue. We're going to write the story of the next chapter of humanity. And there are a number of things that are being created now that we're going to need that the story is going to be written. Things that we won't be able to bring about ourselves, but that God is going to provide for us. The mouth of the well, the mouth of the earth, the mouth of the ass that is going to speak when the ass needs to speak unexpectedly, the rainbow to give us hope, and so on and so forth, the provision of the manna. So those are things that we can't create ourselves, but God creates and provides, so that when we write the story, we go into it with a sense of faithfulness, with a sense of faith that whatever we're going to need, God is going to provide for us. Of course, we have to write the story, we have to have the creativity, the imagination. We have to allow ourselves to reach for the spiritual text that we need to write, and not let other things take over, but to come from that place. And as we write this new Torah, God is there with us to give us all these things that are part of the story that we can't bring about ourselves. So there's, this dialogue as we move forward. I read it as a opportunity for faithfulness, for not to despair. Because one could look at the future and say, how are we going to get through this? Mm-hmm. But there are things that are being created right now. Right now, God is creating things that are going to be available to us, so that together, God and us, we will fashion the next chapter or chapters of the story ahead.
That's one of the things I love, is like we won't be able to know, right, that when we're going to need certain things, but this teaches about that you're, on the one hand, we're not in charge of everything, right? That there's a river underneath that's providing, that will give us what we need in a given moment in time that we have no foresight to be able to see. At the same time, I think the agency read is that Benish Mashot moments are really creative and imaginative times, right? Like if they were for God, so too for us. And that combination to me is a religious orientation in the universe, which is a both and, right? That we have a certain amount of faithfulness, that we can't control everything, and that there is some foundation that's laid in the structure of the universe that will allow for God to unfold what God needs to unfold. And I don't think of God as moving people around on the chessboard, but there's something built into the universe that creates what's needed in a given moment to respond. And at the same time, we too, if we can see the Benish Mashot moments as really creative, powerful moments of, if we're creating God's image, that we embody that creativity and imagination to also think about what is the call of this hour and and I love that combination of orientation.
So I'll go with both of you, and I'll just add and say that there's one thing that is solely within the power of the human being, in this rendering, right? And that is tshuva.
Yes.
But not tshuva in the terms of repentance for sins, because if you look at the exits and entrances, tshuva, I think in this midrash, is basically a state of wakefulness. All we can do is be awake and open. And it's the tshuva is really, in a certain sense, I think, translated here best as a certain state of openness. Entrances, exits, right? To be awake, right? The way the Dalai Lama says, that's all there is to be awake. And if we're awake, then the faithfulness that you speak of has an entrance. But if we're not awake, then it doesn't make a difference what's out there because it's going to pass us by.
I also just love the reminder that at this inflection point, what is coming, we will not live to see it. It will only be known in hindsight, and it's enormously creative. But it's also, it's a reminder that it's so much bigger than me. And it's like, it's not my job to do this. I mean, it's my job to stay awake. I can do that. I can do what I can do we can do collectively what we can do in our small realm, but there is a sort of humility that comes from knowing that the forces at work are so much larger than the world as we know it, or as our minds can comprehend it. And so what does it mean to be awake and ready for the magic, the surprises, the unexpected, but also realize that it's not, we're not sort of called to be the foot soldiers of a change that will not happen if we are not marching.
Yeah.
You know? And that's very humbling.
Yeah. I think we'll conclude here because Shavuot is about being awake. Normally we're awake all night. Normally on a normal year we study here all night until the sunrise.
Yeah.
And we go out to receive the new day and the Torah that is revealed on Shavuot. So I pray that we can all stay awake through these, not just tonight, but these days that are coming, the night as it breaks into dawn and brings new insights, new paths, new opportunities, and that we can all serve, all of us, serve where we are deployed and asked to serve, and bring about something beautiful, something blessed for us, for our communities, for humanity. I just want to end by saying that about Naaseh V'Nishma, we will do and then we will understand. Felicia and I discussed who we would invite, and we said Serene and Shaul. Let's try. I mean, you know, what's the chance that they'll say yes? We called each of you, and before we explained what it was, the answer was yes. Tell me when. And so we have enormous gratitude to both of you for being here with us. We really admire your teaching and your work, and thank you so much for gracing us and for being part of the conversation. I don't think we could have had two better partners to explore these moments in which we find ourselves and celebrate the holiday of Matan Torah, of the giving of the Torah.
Thank you. You know, when Roli called me, he said, "Oh, Shaul, I want to ask you a question." I said, "Yes."
I'm already signed up.
Exactly.
That's right. That's right. So first we want to wish everyone a Chag Sameach. And tomorrow morning services will be at 9:30 for reading the Ten Commandments and having this moment of wedding, of ungarmenting, of possibility of what's to come. And we also, I think this is the fourth part of a series. We've been in conversation with a number of people over the last several weeks to really ask the question of how we can be awake that we not only don't want to sleep through the night of waiting to receive Torah, but we also don't want to sleep through this time, which is ripe with a lot of hard questions, but also a lot of really important questions. And as a community of faith and as a people of faith who's struggling deeply in this moment, particularly in Israel, we're committed to staying awake to these questions and not just moving on. There's no moving on from this moment. And so we want to ask everyone to stay alive in these questions, and we hope as a community too that we'll be doing that as well. It doesn't end on Shavuot. It is a continuous ask. So we wish everyone a beautiful Chag, and we'll see you tomorrow, and then we'll be in the park actually for a picnic, assuming the good weather, around 90th Street or so.
Around 12:30 in the park.
12:30 in the park, yeah. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach,
Chag
everyone.
Sameach.